Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 21st of February, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today, we have Vanessa Beeley and Charles Malet, and also James Roguski will be on a little bit later. We're going to get kicked off today, Vanessa, with the question of a ceasefire in Gaza. What's the latest?
Yeah, the delightful Keir Starmer. I'm starting to kind of make up names for these people, like Sneer Karma. But anyway, allegedly he's called for immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, which goes against his previous stand, which is Israel has the right to defend itself. And if we can just move on, I can just have a look at what Labour has now called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza for the first time in an attempt to head off what threatens to be the biggest rebellion against Keir Starmer since he became party leader. So nothing political about this decision at all, sarcasm intended. Opposition whips published a 237-word amendment to a Scottish National Party motion on Tuesday, setting out the party's stance on the Middle East crisis, which they hope Labour MPs will back instead of a separate amendment from the SNP, calling much more bluntly for a ceasefire. A Labour Party spokesperson has made the following comments to various media outlets, including the BBC. So he's reiterating the amendment calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, whereas in reality the SNP is calling for a ceasefire. Humanitarian ceasefire to me means a pause in hostilities, which will not be respected as it hasn't been historically by Israel, and will then allow Israel to continue with the genocide immediately after. The focus on the need for Israeli hostages to be released and returned quite extraordinary, considering that there's an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinian hostages that have been taken both in the West Bank and from Gaza since October the 7th, of course, not mentioned. This is from Robert Peston, the ITV political editor. He understands this was about 10 hours ago. Keir Starmer will order his MPs to vote against the SNP's motion calling for a Gaza ceasefire. Because he hates the SNP's charge that Israel is engaging in the collective punishment of Palestinians, despite the fact that the ICJ has deemed it a plausible genocide. Starmer is still not admitting that. He knows many of his MPs will rebel against this three-line whip. The stakes will be highest for members of his front bench team because they would be sacked if they vote in opposition to his instructions. So it's a gamble. From Keir Starmer. It's certainly not a genuine desire to end hostilities against the Palestinians. And then bearing in mind the focus on the Israeli hostages, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich sparks outrage after saying returning Gaza hostages is not the most important thing. And we know that a number of hostages have been killed by the Zionist hostility and bombardment of Gaza. So at a spontaneous demonstration following his remarks, a father of an 18-year-old in captivity said, anyone who thinks the hostages aren't important, then let them kidnap your children and then you can talk. Basically, Smotrich, he said he was asked if returning the hostages was the most important thing, and he replied, no, it's not. Why do you want competition? Everything is important. And he then also said on Can Public Radio, he is, of course, known as the far-right finance minister under the Netanyahu coalition regime, added that calls to release the hostages at any cost are incorrect and irresponsible statements. According to him, the only way to get them back, is to defeat Hamas and increase military pressure even more. That's what brought about the previous deal. So what does that, of course, mean? That's effectively a green light for increased bombardment and ground invasion of Rafah in the far south of Gaza. That's supposedly the safe area and the last remaining safe area that has been bombed heavily for at least a week now. Moving on, Algeria called for a UN Security Council vote on Gaza ceasefire resolution. US, this was a few days ago, says it will veto the resolution. Algeria was representing a number of Arab states. And sure enough, the US vetoed the resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The UK abstained, for the usual double act. But I want to just listen to the statement from the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield. Pay close attention to the last section of her statement.
We intend to do this the right way so that we can create the right conditions for a safer, more peaceful future. And we will continue to actively engage in the hard work of direct diplomacy on the ground until we reach a final solution.
I think we can start with Ron.
Interesting wording there, the use of the final solution, which of course is what we are witnessing, the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the US basically vetoed the Algerian resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire on the basis that they're actually working on a draft resolution. But I just want to focus, I could show an awful lot of very distressing footage, particularly from Rafah, of the recent bombing campaign by the IOF that has effectively wiped out entire families in Rafah, and particularly amongst the refugees there. Over 1.3 million people have gathered from different areas of Gaza to the so-called safety of Rafah. But I'm going to focus on northern Gaza, the famine and starvation. And this video is from a journalist in the north who's covering events there. And of course, the IOF has basically been sniping civilians that are trying to reach the meager supplies of flour and humanitarian aid that is literally trickling into the north, that is really suffering famine conditions now. And there are reports that the IOF has effectively created a road cutting northern Gaza from southern Gaza, which will be occupied by the IOF forces. So effectively, there will be no escape from the south to the north and no escape from the north to the south from here on in. So this is a journalist in northern Gaza talking about conditions there.
منذ أيام وأنا أبحث عن وجبة طعام واحدة ولا نجد، وهناك مئات الآلاف من المواطنين لا يستطيعون الحصول على طعام أو شراب أو أي مقومات للحياة. نحن في المرحلة الأشد والأصعب على أبناء شعبنا هنا في شمال غزة. الاحتلال يتعمد ذلك ويتعمد تجويع المواطنين هنا في شمال غزة ويتعمد منع دخول المساعدات والمواد الإغاثية والإنسانية. نحن الآن في كارثة والأمر يشتد الآن علينا، يشتد بشكل كبير. لا نستطيع أن نجد ما نسد به جوعنا وجوع أطفالنا وجوع عائلاتنا.
And in Rafah also, Egypt has basically not been opening the Egyptian Rafah border into Gaza to allow humanitarian aid in. And there is increasing starvation even in Gaza, Rafah itself. This is just a very quick video released today of people in Rafah trying to get bread from the supply. Actually, a friend of mine who I've been able to get in touch with on a fairly regular basis, he was displaced from the north finally to Rafah via Khan Yunis in sort of central Gaza. He told me that when you walk on the streets, you are literally walking among, as he describes it, the walking dead. He said they're like zombies, they're starving, they're terrified, they're traumatized. And of course, there is no medical care now in Rafah. There's no actual hospitals. There's only a sort of a very basic medical center. The other main hospitals have been destroyed or taken over by the IOF. And of course, the US veto, that's the fourth so far, to prevent any kind of immediate ceasefire or even demilitarization, which of course is what it should be, from Gaza by the Israeli forces. The first was a resolution from Brazil, then from UAE, then Russia, and now Algeria. So the US is clearly facilitating the genocide, and so is the UK.
Yeah, well, the UK is very proud of never having used its veto and only ever abstaining on this. But I mean, has the US given any indication of when its draft resolution is going to make an appearance after
No.
the final solution? No doubt.
No. And of course, ongoing with the potential shadow of a ceasefire, what does Israel do, as it always does and has done historically? It increases the ferocity of the attacks against civilians.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Vanessa. Now we're going to come back to the UK and to excess mortality statistics because the ONS pushed this out on X earlier, saying deaths registered in England and Wales in week 6 were 2% lower than the expected number, brackets 251 fewer deaths. Find out more about our new method for estimating the number of excess deaths, replacing the use of 5-year averages. And they have produced a nice little blog. So let's look and see what they had to say on their blog. They said the chosen methodology uses statistical models to obtain the expected number of deaths in each period. Importantly, from this approach, moves away from averages drawn from raw numbers and instead uses age-specific mortality rates. This month, ONS will publish a methodological article detailing the new approach. This will contain estimates for periods before and during the pandemic using this approach and will compare with estimates from the current methodology. So that's what they're saying. But let's have a look at this little estimation that they've published now, which shows the methodology that they use. Now, I'm not going to show on screen the methodology from this, but if you want to go and look at it for yourselves, have a look for estimating excess deaths in the UK, methodology changes, February 2024. But I'm going to show this table from it because this is what they are showing, the comparison of annual numbers of excess deaths estimated by the current and new methodologies, UK 2020 to 2023. And you can see that the new method largely finds that there were fewer excess deaths than previously. Now, if we just at the bottom of this look at some totals, what they're saying is that using the old method, that from 2020 to 2023, there were 216,103 excess deaths. Of course, many of those being attributed to COVID-19. And using the new method, there were only 184,941 excess deaths. And so that is a reduction over that period of 31,162 deaths. Now, you'll notice that particularly for 2023, that seems to be having a fairly large impact because for 2023 at least, the old way of counting would have counted 31,500 deaths, and the new method of counting is just under 11,000 deaths. So you can decide for yourselves whether this new methodology is the correct one or not. I'd be interested to see what various academics think of this. But the point here is, of course, that what we saw was the manipulation of excess mortality figures by the ONS during the course of the so-called pandemic anyway, because they adjusted the time period that the 5-year average was calculated over in the course of that period of time. So, I'd be interested to I'm looking forward to hearing what various other people have to say about this. In the meantime, of course, we've got the pandemic treaty and all the associated material with that. And first of all, I want to bring this on screen. This is a briefing document with respect to a paper which has been published called Repair. And this is entitled Rational Policy Over Panic, the evidence base of the pandemic preparedness agenda does not support the current urgency. And it says here, international health institutions are emphasizing an urgency to prioritize prevention and response to pandemics. Pandemic risk is characterized as an existential threat to humanity and is being used to justify proposed amendment to the international health regulations and a new legally binding pandemic agreement. This agenda is supported by unprecedented annual financial requests for over $10 billion in new overseas development assistance and over $26 billion in LMIC's investment, with over $10 billion additional for One Health interventions. The World Health Assembly will vote on the World Health Organization instruments in May, June 2024. So I'd like to welcome David Bell to the program, who's one of the authors of this report. And we'll just look at a couple more graphics from this summary document in a second. But David, welcome to the program. Tell us what the motivation was for this paper in the first place.
Produced by the Repair Project at the University of Leeds. The motivation is just to get a honest look at the evidence base for the urgency and the scope of pandemic risk. We're hearing, as you said, that from the World Bank, WHO, G20, that there's an exponential increase in risk, that there's an existential threat to humanity. We've gone systematically through the databases that these organizations are using and through their reports and the citations. And essentially what they're citing and the database they're using don't show this at all. There's an increase in reported outbreaks over the last 60, 70, 80 years, which fits very well with the fact that we can detect them now. We've invented PCR, point of care, rapid tests, etc. So we can detect things that we couldn't detect in the past. Over the last 10 to 20 years, there's a reduction in mortality and in the number of outbreaks in their own databases. So what they're telling governments and what they're telling the public is very different than the actual risk that their own data shows, which essentially has surprised us. The difference between reality and their wording is so great.
Well, let me bring this table on screen then, because this is from your document showing events considered by the G20 to be major outbreaks 2000 to 2020 and the mortality associated with each of those. I take it these are World Health Organization statistics. So that then brings into question why the urgency for this massive global infrastructure to be established.
Well, the table is interesting, Mike. So it's the two left-hand columns that are provided by the G20's report. And the one on the right is the best numbers that we could put on that from the literature. The scholarship of the report is such that they don't even give these numbers, but they characterize this as major outbreaks occurring every few years for the last 20 years. So we have on that table COVID at the top, which it appears is not a natural outbreak. I think that's fairly well accepted now. And then you have the swine flu, H1N1, which was far less lethal than the normal seasonal flu, about a quarter of the normal mortality in 2009. After that, for all these outbreaks, you have a total of about 26,000 deaths, and most of those are Ebola, which is confined to West Africa. So this is the sort of information they're giving. 26,000 deaths is about 5 days of tuberculosis in the world in terms of mortality. But this is all the major outbreaks that they can come up with for the last 20 years. So it's really illustrating that this is why we hear about disease X from the WHO, because if you look at actual figures, the burden is so small that it would not justify the sort of money that they're asking for.
Yes, and so that particular graphic there that we just saw, World Health Organization identifies 9 priority diseases for research and development in an emergency context. This includes COVID-19 and a hypothetical outbreak, disease X. Of the 7 other diseases, only Ebola virus has caused an outbreak of over 10,000 deaths in recorded history. And so then you've got to ask, why are they pursuing this so strongly as they are? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of money on the table here. There's tens of billions of dollars. It's an unprecedented amount for public health. And there is a whole industry that's being built around this. So we already have thousands of people, global health, public health people in countries and in international organizations whose salaries are depending on this getting through. So we're building essentially an industry that is self-perpetuating. It's going to have very intensive surveillance. They will find threats because that's normal. You can find viral variants if you look for them, which is why we're finding more outbreaks now. And then, they're putting a mechanism in place through the WHO, the International Health Regulation Amendments, and the WHO agreement that's being negotiated, where they can lock down countries, lock down regions, produce a 100-day vaccine, and then use that to give people their freedom back. And it's generating huge numbers of salaries and work for public health workers, and it's generating huge profits, or it will, for pharma, as we saw it did in COVID-19. So I think primarily it's a business-driven, money-driven issue, but it's got to a point where we have international organizations who are now grossly misrepresenting the actual risks to countries in order, I think, to get this money.
David, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today. And just to finish this off, I mean, where do people find the full report? And in fact, I mean, what would you like to see happen with that full report at this stage?
Well, we would very much like countries, legislators, politicians, and so on to look at this and to read it objectively. It's the report it goes in detail through the reports of these organizations. It's a factual report. It gives the actual risk, and then we need to weigh. Pandemics will happen, outbreaks happen. Of course we should be prepared, but we need to do this proportionate to other health issues, and that's what's not happening now. So the report can be found at the University of Leeds. So I think we can put it on your website, hopefully, Mike, so that people can find the actual report.
Yeah, we'll have that in the notes under this news. Okay, David, thank you very much for joining us. James, maybe I could just invite you to comment on this just for a few seconds. What are your thoughts on this type of report and the justification for what we're going to be talking about in more detail in a few minutes with you?
With work on this, and the two reports have a similarity. If you don't like the data, change the data, and have a new method of estimating data. Have a lie that says that there's a problem when there isn't a problem. And this is what we're dealing around the world with, inability to access data. When I have come to look at this in my mind, whenever I hear officials talk about misinformation, it triggers in my head that what they're dealing with is people like UK Column or David or myself or everyone else presenting the missing information that they don't want people to see. And so, the facts are much different than they would like us to believe. And as long as they can hide them or manipulate them, they can attempt to change public opinion. And so, I will do everything in my power to spread the word on Dr. Bell's report. And it's going to actually mirror what I'm about to say with what we're talking about with the WHO. Read the original source documents, get down to the original data. Whenever you hear somebody say something, the definition of that is hearsay. If it's interesting, go down and dig for the actual core documents. And that's what I hope to talk about with what we had planned.
Okay, thank you, James. Charles, let me welcome you to the program. And you're, of course, still in Africa. What's going on over there on the health front?
Thanks very much, Mike, and good afternoon all. This follows David's segment rather neatly. Recently, I visited an African manufacturer of syringes called Revital, one of very few on the continent to have received WHO pre-qualification for an auto-disable syringe, essentially one that cannot be reused. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, surprise, surprise, put $4 million forward to make this happen. And I visited to better understand the apparent conspiracy between the pharmaceutical industry and its controlling influences to both create and solve a problem at the same time. So Revital in particular is described in its press release as one of 8 manufacturers who have this status, which is very difficult to achieve, and that it will cut down the response time for delivery of syringes throughout Africa. Again, they quote Violaine Mitchell, the director of immunization at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as saying that Revital is paving the way to expand local production of syringes, and also highlighted, she says that they're proud to support Revital's efforts to sustainably expand the supply of these syringes in Africa. We'll come back to the sustainability in a second. I've just got a couple of photographs of the production line of a facility that runs 24 hours round the clock and produces many, many different types of syringes. But as you will have seen in the Gates grant form, they were initially to sort of bolster the COVID-19 vaccine effort and then to deal with what are being referred to as routine immunizations. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, of course, the situation has moved on, and now the focus is on malaria and the delivery of a malaria vaccine. So we have the Malaria Vaccine Implementation Program, which says that as of October last year, the WHO now recommends, specifically highlighted there, the RTS/AS01 vaccine. Now, I've highlighted that for a reason, because it recurs throughout the literature. The WHO go on to describe it as being the first malaria vaccine to be recommended in October 21, and that it's reached nearly 2 million children. Sorry, slip of the tongue, but probably fair to say too many, in Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi since 2019. The WHO go on to talk about who develops and manufactures it. And this is where we begin to see what I'm referring to by way of a suggestion of a conspiracy. Of course, there is support here from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, just as there was for the manufacturer of syringes. Side effects very much downplayed. They say there's an increased risk of febrile seizures, but that they will dissipate soon. And there's no other reference to any possible side effect. The African CDC has got very much behind it, and again highlighted is the specific vaccine here, RTS/AS01. They do at least concede that it shows only partial protection against malaria in young children. But of course, that's where the focus lies, is on young children. Now, what I should do specifically for the audience that may not have travelled to an area that's regarded as being a malarial zone or had any experience with malaria is that malaria is described here by the CDC as being something that has symptoms that are generally non-specific. And there are many things listed: fever, headache, malaise, neurological complaints, pretty much anything. And it finishes with the diagnosis of malaria should also be considered in any person with fever of unknown origin, regardless of travel history. Well, that's an absolutely enormously blank canvas, and very much those that have been in countries in belief in the emergency. It's very similar. And I would say, in terms of the medicine and the regard of the pharmaceutical industry, malaria is Africa's blind spot. And whilst COVID and uptake of the vaccines has been very low in Africa due to a massive skepticism, well-founded, in the pharmaceutical industry, malaria, of course, is used as a catch-all to describe illnesses of almost any kind. So with that in mind, it's easy to see how the suggestion of a vaccine for malaria could produce results that might not be found elsewhere. And again, just at the bottom of that slide there, again, the CDC suggesting that despite the fact these could be symptoms of anything, patients suspected of having malaria should be urgently evaluated. So we wind the clock back now to 2013 to see where the partnership between GlaxoSmithKline and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation started. And the text of that press release then refers again to the RTSS vaccine strain, specifically cited. So what we'll do now is we'll just have a quick look at, a listen to Ronique Vora, who I spoke to, the Director of Sales at Revital. And this is his take on how the cogs were within the pharmaceutical machine.
I mean, Gates Foundation is not stupid to invest money in this organization. USAID is not stupid to invest money in this organization. There must be something that Revital is doing for them to be confident enough to give millions of dollars into Revital for further expansions. As long as, especially if you're proving to them. And all of these organizations at the end of the day are kind of linked to each other.
Yes.
Gates Foundation can call UNICEF in a jiffy and say, hey, how's Revital? What do you think about this? They can call FIND, they can call PATH, they can call IFC, EFC, they can call any of these guys and say, hey, we're looking at an investment, what do you think about this?
So exactly as he articulates there, there really are wheels within wheels, and due process is really sort of cast to the wind. The other thing that I want to return back to is the idea of sustainability. I asked him very much about the waste that's produced from their products, which are, of course, exclusively made from oil-based plastics. And here from 2021, from the Journal of Waste Management and Research, is a bit of text saying that the estimate going back to 2021 that nearly 300,000 tons of medical waste every year is produced in Africa. And highlighted is the text that regular disposal of pharmaceutical waste into general waste has allowed streams of different medicines to enter landfill and aquatic environments in Africa. This has affected the quality of the surrounding land and water accessed by the residents and wildlife. Now, that's something that's just not talked about by those that would be the same people who are, of course, sponsoring such initiatives, very much banging the drum for climate and the environment, but at the same time, not in any way checking the businesses that they're sponsoring on the other side of the fence. On screen now is a photograph of the production facility. This is all the raw material plastic that will go into those syringes, and these are the molding machines that run 24/7 to produce these disposable plastics, for which there's no plan and there's absolutely no pressure on the industry to change the way in which they're producing. So it's very contradictory, and one might say, in fact, completely hypocritical, really. Now, I concluded by asking him what his sort of projections and predictions were for 2024-25. And this could be extrapolated probably across Africa, but he referred specifically to the government of Kenya, who are sending 100,000 healthcare professionals out to more remote communities in order to educate about health. I think we can see where that's going to go. Concurrent with that, Revital are going to put another 100,000 subcontracted employees into a similar role, but specifically to take testing equipment out to rural communities. And lo and behold, they will also be able to provide treatments for anything that may be identified by such tests. He was also very quick to point out that malaria and diabetes would be the priorities in terms of vaccine delivery for this year, not just within Kenya, but Africa as a whole. So it's a fascinating insight. And as I say, they really came across as being a naive but willing participant in this scheme, unaware really of exactly how they're being manipulated through funding in order to achieve a particular aim. Also worth noting that he himself was very much aware of the rush within which the COVID vaccines had been produced. He had several vaccine-injured friends. And so, I hope to be able to make the full audio recording available at some point.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. James, let's welcome you back to the program now at this point. And of course, you're here to talk about the latest developments with respect to the World Health Treaty and the IHR. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the parallels are absolutely astonishing. The naive involvement in these plans, I think is universal. And so what I'm hoping to talk about, if you want me to just jump right into it, is what's going on now is the treaty, most people call the pandemic treaty. Negotiations are going on this week, next week, then they're going to take a 2-week break. They're going to come back for another 2 weeks. And because they're having difficulty reaching agreement, they're talking about having additional negotiations into March, April, maybe even into May. And I want to make sure people distinguish between the two separate tracks. There are negotiations for amendments to the international health regulations, which are separate from the new pandemic treaty. Now, we've talked about before that the deadline to reveal to the nations what the final package of amendments to be considered in May has already passed. They failed to propose any package of amendments by January 27th of this year, a couple of weeks ago, which is 4 weeks in advance of the May 27th start of the assembly. And there is a rule, Article 55 in the International Health Regulations, saying that they have to do so 4 months in advance. So arguably, if they were, likely to follow their own rules, they missed their deadline and they should not be able to even consider amendments at the upcoming World Health Assembly in May. Now, there are 12 points in the new version of the pandemic treaty that I'm just going to touch on very quickly, but the core of what I want to get across to people is you can actually read these documents. Please listen to what we're talking about, but go to the source and see for yourself what these documents actually say. It looks, to me, like a financial venture capital prospectus to build out the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex in places like Africa or other low income nations. So number one on the list is that while people call this a treaty or an accord or by many other names, they've always said from the beginning that they want it to be a framework convention. And that really matters because what that means is they can agree to anything, but what they're really agreeing to is in Chapter 3, which is an ongoing yearly meeting, a conference of the parties, very similar to the Framework Convention for Climate Change, where in 1992, all the nations signed on to a framework, but then year after year after year, that framework gets filled in with details that we, the people, don't have any input into. Now, they want to create a massive bureaucracy. They don't call it the Conference of the Parties in the newest version. They call it the governing body of the pandemic agreement. And they've got at least 10 other committees that they would want to create. Again, as David Bell said, they want to put billions of dollars into this to massively expand, big pharma. But the core that they're having great difficulty with is what they call a pathogen access and benefit sharing system. If you look at this sideways, it looks very close, to the proliferation of biological weapons. They want to use the One Health surveillance approach to go seeking out pathogens with pandemic potential. That's their term. Bring it into a WHO coordinated laboratory network. They want to oversee gain of function. Believe it or not, that's in this document. And then they want to speed up the approval of products to treat these problems, which may or may not be causing death or disease. They may just be having the potential to do so. And then oversee a global supply chain and logistics network to deliver these products as the WHO directs. Now, there's not much talk at this point because the United States is working on speeding up regulatory approval and holding big pharma liable for any of these problems. They want to throw public money at that. The USA apparently was negotiating or dealing with those changes, and those articles, Articles 14 and 15, are not yet available. But in addition to the attempts to censor any countering views, what I encourage everyone to do, I've put it all up on stopthetreaty.org, stopthetreaty.org. Read the document. Be careful when you read Chapter 1, because you might end up getting diabetes because the language is so sickeningly sweet. It's just filled with propaganda. They figure people will start reading it, only read Chapter 1, think, hey, it sounds pretty good. The sleep-inducing meat of it in Chapter 2 if you read a chapter, an article a night, you won't need a sleeping pill or any kind of sedative for about a month and a half. But you really want to read chapter 3, because that's where they would set up this zombie bureaucracy that would meet year after year after year to decide how to disperse all of this money. And there's no audit trail. And I think the simplest point is Tedros recently said that he has the WHO has a 20,000 square meter distribution point in Dubai. Just think about how many soccer fields that might be, and imagine how much it would cost to get contracts to fill such a facility with pandemic-related products. This is a business deal, and it's as corrupt as anything you could possibly imagine. This is organized crime in its development phase.
Yeah, James, thank you very much for that. David, let me just bring you back to see if you've got any final comments on what we've covered since in the last couple of minutes.
It's what James said. Essentially, this is built on air. It's an industry. They're building a self-perpetuating mechanism which will absorb huge amounts of funding. It must find reasons for its existence in order to survive. So it will spread fear about exaggerated risk of outbreaks, and it will use that to sort of get more money, more funding, and keep this mechanism going. And it needs to be, there needs to be a pause, essentially. Countries need to stop. There's no reason whatsoever to have these instruments go forward, as James said, in May for a vote at the World Health Assembly. They're not ready. As we showed through the University of Leeds work, there's a lot of misrepresentation of data within these and justifying these. So everyone needs to step back. There's no rush in this. There's a huge opportunity cost because other diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis that kill very large numbers of people, diabetes, they will suffer in order to move money to these very small, very rare problems, which we're now building a whole industry around.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, David. Thank you, James. We need to move on now. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, if you would like to support us, please head over to support.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us there, and that would be very much appreciated. You could pick something up at the UK Column shop, but please share anything you find on the various platforms, especially ukcolumn.org, ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. Now, yesterday I was speaking to David Siegel on climate science, and if you haven't seen that discussion yet, please do go and have a look at that. And a quick reminder that on Sunday this week we'll be holding a symposium on midazolam entitled "The Midazolam Murders: Exposing State-Sanctioned Involuntary Euthanasia." Join us for that if you possibly can. That will begin at 6 p.m. UK time on Sunday evening. And tomorrow, we don't have a graphic for it, but tomorrow at 1 p.m. there'll be a discussion with Brian and Diane Rasmussen-McCaddy, one of the Gutsy Women series. Do join at 1 p.m. for that as well. Now back to you, Vanessa, and the United Nations, this is quite a dark topic, I suspect.
Yeah, this is a new report that has just been published by UN experts that include Francesca Albanese, who's been very much vilified by Israel for speaking out strongly against the genocide of Palestinians throughout the Palestinian territories, including Gaza. UN experts are appalled by reported human rights violations against Palestinian women and girls. And if we can just have a look at a section of the report, they have been arbitrarily executed in Gaza, often together with family members, including their children, according to information received. We are shocked by reports of the deliberate targeting and extrajudicial killing of Palestinian women and children in places where they sought refuge or while fleeing. Some of them were reportedly holding white pieces of cloth when they were killed by the army or affiliated forces. They expressed serious concern about the arbitrary detention of hundreds of Palestinian women and girls, including human rights defenders, journalists, and humanitarian workers in Gaza and the West Bank since 7th of October, when we were talking about hostages previously. It's fine, we can move on to the image, Mike. So this is an image of Hadil, the mother, and her child, Imad. I do warn people that the section of video that we're going to show is distressing. I would say that the mother, Hadil, did not survive the sniping by IOF forces as they were trying to flee Gaza City. Her son, her little boy, Imad, was injured, and you will see that he was rescued, and so far he has survived the Israeli ravages. So I do warn, this is distressing. Thank you, Mike. And of course, we're actually seeing many reports of this, of injured Palestinians being forced to basically bleed to death for upwards of 24 hours because the Israelis are firing on anyone trying to rescue them. There are multiple cases on a daily basis. The report says that they're particularly distressed that Palestinian women and girls in detention have also been subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault, such as being stripped naked and searched by male Israeli army officers. At least 2 female Palestinian detainees were reportedly raped, while others were reportedly threatened with rape and sexual violence. They also noted that photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances were reportedly taken by the Israeli army and uploaded online. There is a disturbing report of at least 1 female infant forcibly transferred by the Israeli army into Israel, and of children being separated from their parents whose whereabouts remain unknown. So the first video is actually one of the female detainees from Gaza who was returned to Gaza, speaking about what happened to them.
خدونا على المعتقل، كانوا يمسكونا زي الكلاب يمشونا من شعورتنا هيك. كانوا في الدباسات تحت البارودة، خدونا بالبساطير عفادنا، يجيبوا الصندل ووجهتنا، دمعية شعورتنا، تفتيش حتى وانت عارية، يفتشوا جسمك.
This kind of humiliation is extremely disturbing for these Palestinian women, but also for the men who were forced to actually witness the humiliation of the women. You will see that this testimony, the guy is visibly disturbed by what he saw and by the absolute abuse of the women prisoners that were alongside him.
هذا تفاصيله لا كان من ضمن الاسيرات اللي معنا اسيرتين مرقوهن علينا داخل القسم او داخل المعتقل اللي احنا كنا فيه اللي هو خيام عاريات لا يوجد عليهم سوى الاواعي الداخليه. انا واحد منهم مشاحت بنطلوني في هذيك اللحظه ارميه اصله فيه البنت، تعرضت للعقاب لمده 3 ايام متواصل تحت تعرض الضرب. واحده من الاسيرات بعد ما طلعت من عند المخابرات او من تحت التحقيق مرقت شعرها طويل، طلعت شعرها مقصوص، فيش لها شعر. عارفين انتوا هذا الكلام لوين بصل؟ لا. عارفين انت يعني ايش معنى؟ انه انت تعبر نسائنا تتعرى امامنا بدون اي.
I mean, the longer that this genocide continues and the more of these reports come out, that what we're watching minute by minute is quite horrific.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Vanessa. Charles, let's come back to you and move back to Africa and Addis Ababa, the African Union Summit taking place.
That's right, Mike. The annual summit has just concluded in Ethiopia, the African Union, which gives us the chance to evaluate the suggestion that multipolarity may challenge the world order. If so, how and to what end? So we just look at, as a reminder, Agenda 23, which is supposed to be the driving force behind the direction of the African Union at the moment, highlighted text suggesting that it's focused on decolonization and that Agenda 2063 is built on existing African frameworks, programs and declarations, consultations with a broad spectrum of African stakeholders. Indeed, that is the case. We see here a tweet from the African Union Education Programme saying that the theme for the year is education in Africa. But already there's mention of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, reference to SDG 4 targets. So we see exactly what sort of meddling is there in this apparent era of decolonization. And we've got the UN Conference on Trade and Development urging governments to create widespread adoption of digital technologies. The AU themselves talk about the implementation of the 2030 agenda and Agenda 2063. So huge overlay there. And indeed, from the AU website, a slide showing that there is a linking of Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. So there was quite a lot of text in background before the summit started, and I thought of particular interest was the statement on the UNESCO website with particular regard to education. They stated that the official launch was on February 17th in Addis, and it will be preceded by a pre-launch event. The pre-launch event will bring together many different entities, the chairperson of the AU, of the African Union Commission, but also notably UN agencies such as UNECA, UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and partner institutions, including NGOs such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Global Programme for Education. So Africa not really forging the path of independence that it might be suggesting it is. So just digging deeper into the education piece, we look at what's referred to as CSA, which is the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. And again here, tied into Sustainable Development Goal 4, which of course is owned by the United Nations and not the African Union. This comes from the AU Digital Education Strategy and Implementation Plan from September 2022. And quite rightly, they say that education is a sector that is fundamental to all other sectors. But in common with what we're seeing across the more developed world, there is this obsession with digital technology being used to access information and public services highlighted there. And of course, the suggestion that people must be able to confidently participate in the digital economy. Again, like with so many of these digital initiatives, there's no sensible or rational articulation of why a digital platform is either necessary or better than the existing form of that particular identity document or format. So the AU keeping us guessing there. But what they do go on to refer back to, again, exactly like in the developed world, is that digital education is vital for recovery and resilience in post-COVID-19 Africa. Essentially, we wouldn't be where we are now without having it. So the vultures are given the opportunity to circle with this in mind. So just a quick portfolio of those that are now sniffing about in the sort of digital education environment. Here we've got DEA, Digital Education Africa Network. Also more familiar, the Oracle Academy, referring to its 9th African Summit, which was just last year. And then of Blair Institute and its Digital Academy, which Ben Rubin has spoken about in recent UK column news. Oracle, of course, will, I presume, stick in the mind of many members of the audience. Here's the president of Kenya, William Ruto, tweeting just at the end of January about a partnership between government of Kenya and Oracle. Worth noting that the president of Oracle is called Scott Twaddle. Ruto goes on to suggest that this underscores Oracle's commitment to aimed at driving the digital transformation of government, public institutions, business startups. But of course, what he fails to do, again, is explain why that's necessary, especially in a country that has such limited resources and indeed access to the very digital services that people are supposed to be able to utilize. So just a reminder of the direction in which these things are going. And even though the focus is education, of course, the moment we start to use references to companies such as Oracle, we're reminded of the Tony Blair Institute and Oracle back in 2020, launching a vaccine management cloud, and indeed related very much to that and being rolled out in parts of Africa is the concept now of digital identity being something that's foisted upon a child at birth and works in conjunction with an immunization record. So here we have the United Nations blowing the horn for Identity for Africa, ID for Africa, and look where they've had funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So again, no great surprises there. What I would like to draw your attention to at the moment is that Gates, although he doesn't declare it on any of his websites, at least I couldn't find a reference to it, is that he is now advising the government of Kenya at the moment on the rollout of their digital provision for identity, which they're calling Maisha Namba, which essentially is roughly translates as a number for life. That's a progression from what was Huduma Namba, which was a service number. But they've had trouble all the way with this in terms of their use of data. And so it's worth noting that the High Court in Kenya, reported here on biometricupdate.com, cites the obstacle in the path raised by the High Court, saying that the lack of a data protection impact assessment has scuttled the Kenya government's rollout of the Maisha Number National Digital ID project, with the country's High Court ruling it must pause. The court intervention is a repeat of a decision that ultimately marked the beginning of the end of the digital ID scheme's predecessor, Huduma Number. And they go on, the implementation of the associated chip-bearing physical identity card, digital ID, unique personal identifier, and the National Master Population Register must all halt until the project is compliant with Kenya's Data Protection Act. Now, I strongly suspect, like you do, that that obstacle will be cleared before a huge amount more time elapses. But nonetheless, notable that the court has actually stood up and said something to at least check the progress of this rolling out. So again, to go back to the question I posed at the beginning about multipolarity and indeed whether we do see it, I would say from what we've just been through that in actual fact we're seeing really a neo-colonization and a new scramble for Africa, but particularly for digital Africa, and that in fact all routes really lead to the same place, and that the sense that there is any degree of multipolarity for any benefit to anybody is a highly questionable point of view.
Charles, thank you very much for that. Now, in James Roguski's 12 Reasons to Stop the Treaty, number 12 is censorship. So let's just talk about censorship to finish off the programme today. Of course, we'll start off with Julian Assange and his court case going on yesterday. It's continuing today. Yesterday, defence lawyers were arguing that there's no evidence anyone had been harmed as a result of what WikiLeaks had done. They cited some case law talking about or suggesting that prosecuting a journalist for doing what he did was unprecedented and so on. But they were focusing quite, this is, by the way, on screen at the moment is some of the people that were there this morning or yesterday. I think this was yesterday. But let's just have a look at some of the comments from the defence, because they were making the point that the previous judges in the previous hearings had been talking about domestic legislation with respect to whether Assange should be extradited to the United States or not. And they were saying that they were citing the Extradition Act, which says that a person's extradition to a Category 2 category is barred by reason of extraneous considerations if and only if it appears that And it talks about political opinions. It talks about things like race, religion, and sexual orientation, and things like this as well. But it refers to political opinions. It doesn't refer to political offences as such, which is what he is being accused of. And it also goes on to talk about if he might be prejudiced at his trial or punished, detained, or restricted in his personal liberty by reason of his political opinions. But they were making the point yesterday that the previous judges were relying on this domestic legislation when they should have been relying on the extradition treaty, which says very clearly that extradition shall not be granted if the offence for which extradition is requested is a political offence. And this is the extradition treaty between the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the government of the United States of America. So this is referring to a political offence, which is what Assange is accused of. And so that was one of the main points that they were making yesterday. Of course, the defence finished yesterday. The prosecution is dealing with issues today. But Redacted carried this article yesterday saying Julian Assange judge previously acted for MI6, and they're making the point that the judge in this case had represented the Secret Intelligence Service and the Ministry of Defence in the past. This is Judge Jeremy Johnson, and also specially vetted barrister. So we may consider that to be a massive conflict of interest, but we will wait and see what happens with Assange later. Now, moving on, then, of course, Ofcom has been active, and they've decided that they want to bring an investigation into GB News for their programme, The People's Forum, the Prime Minister. They said that they've received around 500 complaints about the programme, which aired on the 12th of February 2024. They went on to say, we're investigating under Rules 5.11 and 5.12 of the Broadcasting Code, which provide additional due impartiality requirements for programmes dealing with matters of political controversy and major matters relating to current public policy. And they went on to say that specifically Rules 5.11 and 5.12 require that an appropriate wide range of significant views must be included and given due weight in such programmes or in clearly linked and timely programmes. Now, of course, the GB News is making the point that they had a studio audience there. They didn't vet the questions that were going to be asked. But the question is this really about not having a range of significant views, or is this some kind of retaliation for something which may have happened on the programme? Let's just remind ourselves, because I'm sure most people have seen this, but just remind ourselves of what did happen on the programme.
Hi, Rishi Sunak. I've got so much to say, but such little time. My name is John Watt, and I'm one of the COVID vaccine injured in this country. I want you to look into my eyes, Rishi Sunak, and I want you to look at the pain, the trauma, and the regret I have in my eyes. We have been left with no help at all. Not only am I in here that's vaccine injured, there's another man over there whose life's been ruined by that COVID-19 vaccine. I know people who have lost legs, amputations. I know people with heart conditions like myself, Rishi Sunak. Why have I had to set up a support group in Scotland to look after the people that have been affected by that COVID-19 vaccine?
So again, I'm sure people will make up their own minds about what the real problem with that programme was. And then finally, just to end with this, because the UK has announced the new UK-Australia Cooperation in Online Safety and Security Memorandum of Understanding. This is all about making sure that we deal with disinformation and misinformation appropriately. Let's just have a look at a little bit of the text. Both participants, that's the UK and Australia, will share best practice and deepen collaboration on countering misinformation and disinformation, which they say is a threat to our democracies and social cohesion. Both participants will develop and promote evidence-based online media and digital literacy initiatives for all user groups, particularly underserved communities and groups most at risk of harm in response to online harms, including misinformation and disinformation. So we've seen bilateral and multilateral defence agreements over the last number of years with respect to military activity. We're starting to see similar deals being done between nations with respect to misinformation and disinformation, so-called, because governments becoming increasingly concerned about the truth getting out. So that is another thing we've got to keep an eye on as they build this censorship or disinformation industrial complex. Look, we will leave it there for today. I want to say thank you very much to Vanessa, to Charles, to James, and to David for joining us today. We'll be back in a few minutes if you're a UK Column member for some extra. But otherwise, we will see you on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual. See you then. Bye-bye.